I was just obsessed. Hello, Celeste here from Yarn to Table. I have a bit of a different setup today just in terms of the camera angle because I'm gonna sit here and knit while I talk. Thought we could have a bit of a cozy chat, and I could share with you the story of my fiber knitting journey, my history up until now. This is not so much like an official tag video like the sweater knitters tag that I put up, but I definitely would also like to hear other people share their journeys if you are so inclined. But I thought, you know, I've seen other podcasters do something similar to this as part of a regular episode or a first episode or as bonus content as I'm doing it now. And I thought it would be fun to do because my knitting journey is long and has some twists and turns just in terms of like, I haven't always knit as regularly as I do now or as obsessively as I do now, but it's always been a big part of my life for the last 20 years. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of put that whole story all in one place so that new viewers can reference it and, you know, if they want to, and anyone who's maybe heard parts and pieces of the story at different times can kind of hear the whole thing all together. So obviously grab your knitting if you haven't yet, grab a cup of tea or coffee or whatever, and let's have a cozy little chat. So my knitting journey begins when I was about 10 years old. My fiber journey really began before that. I grew up in a household where my mother sewed Halloween costumes for me and special occasion dresses and things like that. She didn't sew all of our clothes, but she definitely knew what she was doing with a sewing machine. And she had grown up in the kind of family where people did a lot of sewing and crochet, but not necessarily a lot of knitting. So my grandmother, my mother's mother, knows how to knit, but she didn't do a lot of it. And there were a couple heirlooms that got passed around, but they were primarily crocheted afghans, some that were quite complex, like that traditional sort of raised rose technique one that you sometimes see in the antique pattern magazines. Lots of little, you know, doilies and flowers and things like that. Lots of crocheting, lots of sewing, but knitting wasn't really a big thing. Now, when I was a little kid, I recognized the look of knitting. I recognized those V shapes in stockinette, and that was what I really wanted to learn how to do because I was very into fashion and I wanted to learn how to knit myself sweaters and accessories that would look like what I saw knitted, and I could tell the difference between that and the crochet that my mother would occasionally do and that some of the heirlooms in our family that we had in our house, the stitches that they had, I could tell the difference. So I asked my mom, like, can I learn to do the thing that makes the V's? And she explained to me that that was knitting, and that she didn't know how, but she would teach me to crochet. So she taught me to crochet. In her version of this story, I sort of created crocheting myself, like finger crocheting, but I feel like I must have seen someone doing it somewhere. But anyway, she taught me how to crochet with a hook. So sorry, Mom, I know you're probably screaming at the screen. You invented crochet. I don't think I could have, but thank you for believing that in me. I think if you saw me doing that, I must have gotten it from somewhere. But I do know that you taught me how to do it with a hook properly. So anyway, I pretty much never got past chaining. I mean, like, I think technically I learned like double or triple or something at some point. I know my brother learned it enough that he made like a placemat I just wasn't that interested because it wasn't what I wanted. It didn't create the fabric that I wanted. I knew that what I wanted was knitting. So that happened when I was maybe around 7 or 8. By the time I was 10, I had become self-possessed enough that I was like, this needs to happen. And my mother found a book called Kids Can Knit, which she bought for me. And then she took me to a yarn store. And you know, you're probably thinking that what happened was I got lessons at the yarn store, but I did not. In fact, I just bought some needles and some yarn, and I had the Kids Can Knit book, and I went on home and I taught myself based on the diagrams in the book how to do the basic knit stitch. Now, these diagrams were illustrated, and in my memory they did not even have illustrations of fingers holding the yarn. I believe they just had the illustrations of the yarn and the needles. And so I kind of figured out for myself how I was going to hold the yarn, which is why I hold it to this day in this kind of strange way, which you might notice as I'm going along knitting here. I'm sort of throwing with my left, which is particularly strange given that I'm right-handed. But there you have it. That's how I knit. As I've talked about in the past, I would really like to practice picking properly because I think that it would speed me up and be a little bit more ergonomic. I don't have a problem with doing things my own way if they work well, but I don't actually think that it's serving me that well anymore, especially as I'm trying to get into colorwork and being able to knit more freely two-handed without holding on to the needles, being able to sort of strand the yarn better and tension it better, I think would help me a lot. I also typically have to size down about 2 needle sizes because knitting this way makes me a very loose knitter. And that can get difficult when you're starting to get into some really fine gauge projects because you're having to size down into needles that can be hard to come by and are just quite small and fiddly. So there's a number of reasons why I really would like to change my tensioning, but I just do not seem to be able to find the time or the discipline to do it. I've been talking about doing it for about a year. I've purchased a Craftsy course. I know how I want to strand the yarn. I want to do it like this, and then you kind of hook, and I can kind of do it, but it just, well, I'm usually even better than this, but it's getting caught on my sweater. But anyway, I just need to practice it so that I get faster. I just haven't. So that's how I got started, and that's why I knit so weird. So this was at 10 years old. The first thing that I knit was a garter stitch scarf. Just decided I was going to knit a scarf. I cast on a random number of stitches, and I knit and I knit. And of course, as you know, garter stitch does not really create that perfect stockinette V shape that I was looking for. And this was very frustrating to me because that was what I wanted. However, I could tell by looking closely at the stitches and pulling them apart that between those garter ridges there were V's in there and I could see them. So I knew that there was something going on, that I was doing some kind of stitch that was different than what I wanted, and that if I learned more, I would eventually be able to make the kind of fabric that I really wanted. Of course, those V's that I was seeing were all of the knit rows. As you know, in garter stitch, you have the knit rows alternating with the purl rows because you're knitting on both sides in the flat. So I kind of set it aside for a little bit, and I would knit random things here and there. And then where my education really took off and my interest really, really took off was a few years later when I started watching a show called Nitty Gritty, which was hosted by Vicky Howell. And some of you are probably familiar with her and possibly with this show. She now has a show that she launched, a web series that she launched with a Kickstarter campaign, which I contributed to and mentioned a little while ago when that was going on, because she was just a huge influence on my knitting life. So I'm like a teenager at this point, maybe a young teenager when I first started watching it. And the show Nitty Gritty combined tutorials and just showing all these new interesting techniques with having designers on who were showing off, their patterns and how they could use how to do the techniques that you needed for these various patterns. And so there was always something new to learn, and they were very good at explaining. Vicki always took the time to explain the theory behind everything. And so by watching this television show, all of this is before the days of YouTube, which of course would have been very helpful because videos are just such a great way to learn knitting. But by watching this show, I was able to progress beyond garter stitch and in fact try out some really, really unusual things like illusion knitting, which is where you use stripes of different colors as well as changes in the surface of the knitting with knits and purls to create essentially what is like one of those 3D pictures, and it has an image that is visible from some angles and not from others. Just a wild thing. And like I knit a scarf for my aunt that was the pattern that they had on the show for that illusion knitting. It was it had the hearts and hearts and diamonds and spades and clubs. So it was like a playing card themed scarf, and she liked poker, so I knit that for her. I learned lace, I learned how to cable, I learned, weird things like the illusion knitting. I mean, just everything, all kinds of crazy techniques, short rows, and just, I really began to understand the fundamentals, and I experimented with all kinds of different things, including intarsia and, baubles. But a lot of the knitting that I did, because I have traditionally been so much more a process knitter than a product knitter, a lot of the knitting that I did was on random swatches that I never kept. Like I would practice a technique like baubles by just doing something on a swatch, or on things that I would give away as gifts to people. So I never really had that much to show for myself, and I never made sweaters. I did make an intarsia tank top with the mud flap girl on it from that Stitch and Bitch book, which I gave to a friend, and I made a sort of ribbed and slightly cabled sweater vest for my mother. But not a lot in the way of big projects, not a lot in the way of things that I enjoyed wearing myself. It was much more a kind of challenge and experiment and just sort of doodling around kind of thing. And I think the big reason for that is that I was not exposed to a lot of patterns of things that I really wanted to wear, that I wanted to have in my wardrobe. And that's because I hadn't discovered Ravelry. So I would look for patterns in pattern books, and sometimes I would find things that I liked to wear. I remember making a shrug for myself and wearing that, so that's almost like a sweater. But for the most part, I was just more interested in experimenting with these techniques rather than coming at it from the perspective of like what kind of item I wanted, because even in the books that I looked through, I would find sweaters that I could imagine wearing, but they weren't really things that I just had to have. It wasn't the kind of to die for stuff that I'm able to find on Ravelry today with just access to so many more patterns, and particularly being able to like follow a particular designer who I know has a style that I like, and just finding those really contemporary, fashiony sweaters, which I love to knit now. So I'm knitting a lot of swatches, and I'm trying a lot of new techniques, and I'm knitting some things for gifts. At some point around this time, I officially did join Ravelry, but without really realizing it. And that's because I purchased a pattern from Knit Picks that showed up in Ravelry, I guess was how the digital purchase process worked. Something along those lines, or I found it through Knit Picks. This was around the time that I discovered Knit Picks, and Knit Picks was a real revelation to me, because up until then my choices had been craft stores or yarn stores, and yarn stores had really lovely but quite expensive yarn, and of course I was a teenager, so I was oftentimes, bankrolling my own experiments, or else at least asking my parents to buy me things, and I didn't want to just spend their money willy-nilly. I was kind of self-conscious about spending a ton of money on like really luxury fibers, especially since I was mostly just swatching and messing around with things anyway, right? So I didn't at that time purchase a lot of the natural, really wonderful fibers that I would find in the yarn stores, but I wasn't really that into the acrylics that I would find at craft stores either. I didn't like the way that they felt. I could tell that the ones that were expensive from the yarn stores were better and different. I found out about Knit Picks through a friend of my mother's who knits, and that really opened up a world of natural fiber to me, because it was affordable enough that I just never had to feel tempted to buy the really cheap acrylic stuff ever again, because Knit Picks was like so affordable. But I really discovered through that how much a difference natural fibers made. So of course at this point in my life I think of Knit Picks as kind of a bargain option, and I tend to buy more expensive things than that, because I think my taste has developed to notice more detailed things like how this fiber has been spun, and wanting breed specific wool, and things like that. Although Knit Picks certainly still has its place for me, and there are a few bases from Knit Picks that I do quite like a lot. But yeah, that was a big deal. So I'm a teenager at this point. I've discovered Knit Picks. I haven't really discovered Ravelry, although technically I have had a Ravelry account for a long time, which I only learned a few years ago when I actually got on Ravelry. And I tried to sign up with my email address and they already had it. So at this point, going through high school and into college, I'm knitting things occasionally, and again, it's a lot of gifts, it's a lot of swatches, it's a lot of just experimenting and trying new techniques, and it's not a regular practice that I do every day. It's something that I will do if I'm in a play. I did a lot of theater around that time. I initially went to college, to a conservatory to get a BFA, so that was kind of like what I was pursuing pretty intensely for a while there. And I would either be cast in a show or I would be working on a show. And there would be lots of downtime with rehearsals. I also helped teach a lot of acting classes in the preparatory school at the college. And so I would, kind of like have a lot of downtime there as well, just sort of sitting in the corner, like while the students were, walking around practicing body centers or, different movement things, or doing like Meisner repetitions or whatever they were doing. And so I would knit a lot during times like that, or on road trips. I wasn't knitting in movie theaters or restaurants or just in the car any day or while I was watching TV or in all those moments every single day yet. It was more a thing that I would do for the longer stretches of time, and it was also something that I would do kind of project by project. So I would only be working on one project at a time, and then when that project was finished, I might go several months or even a year without knitting. And then I would kind of have an occasion where I wanted to knit, so I would find a project, or I would have an occasion where I wanted to make a gift for someone. Like when I started dating my now husband, Ryan, I wanted to make him a scarf. So at that time, I wasn't knitting anything. So I went and I got some yarn and I knit him a scarf. And then when the scarf was done, I didn't knit anything again for like 6 months. And then I, you know, got in the mood again or something. So it was not at the intense pace that it is now. But I was a fairly advanced knitter at that point because of all of the stuff I'd learned from Vicki Howell's show. And also at this time, I was knitting primarily things that I was making up myself. So because I wasn't finding a lot of patterns that I was completely wild about, and because I understood so much of the fundamentals and so many interesting techniques thanks to Vicki Howell, I was able to basically just knit things from my head, which was primarily what I liked to do. So I would knit like a pretty simple ribbed scarf or a hat or something like that, but also slightly more complex things. Like I came up with a pretty basic pattern that I think a bunch of people have versions of, but I created a like a knitted headband that covers your ears and then like cables over in the middle so it almost looks like a turban. I think I've shown that on the show before. I designed like a Mobius strip cowl, which I think I've shown before. So kind of things like that. Nothing that was crazy complicated, no garments, but I was primarily just sort of playing around with yarn, finding the yarns that I liked, using scraps, using them in new ways. I would knit these scarves that I called kitchen sink scarves, where I would take all kinds of different scraps and I would basically knot them together like into a magic ball, but with big old knots that were showing, like not even magic knots or anything. And I would also do like ribbons and strips of torn old bed sheets and stuff just mixed in with the yarn, and the yarn at all different weights. And I would create this crazy magic ball from that, and then I would just knit a garter stitch scarf out of it just to really show off the kind of magpie crazy texture and color of the scarf. And I would occasionally knit things that I found patterns for, especially if I were doing gifts for someone, or if I had something more kind of specific that I wanted, or if I saw something in a book that I really liked. So at this point, I'm in the latter years of college. I'm about 20 or 21. This is when I first met and moved in with my husband, and I did a lot of taking out just every knitting pattern book I could imagine from the library, because again, still clueless to Ravelry. Although this was 10 years ago, so I think Ravelry was around, but it wasn't as popular or huge as it is now. I would take out a lot of knitting pattern books from the library, and I would make photocopies of things that I thought I might want to make and store them in a big file. But I never actually made that many of them because I was still making things on kind of a casual basis. I never was knitting more than one thing at once, and I wasn't knitting every day. But I was starting to get closer to the kind of knitting obsession that I have now. And this whole time, I always did think of knitting as one of my favorite things to do. It was always one of my biggest hobbies, even though comparatively I was not as serious of a knitter. It just made me so happy, and it was so consistently something that I knew that I loved. Where things really changed and I became the knitter that I am today was toward the end of 2016. What happened was so I had a day where I was recording my auditory podcast, Return to Stars Hollow, and I decided to paint my nails while I recorded it. I had never really done something at the same time as recording before, and I realized that painting my nails was such a wonderful thing to do while I recorded because it kept me sitting still for 2 hours, so I knew that I wouldn't mess up my nail polish. I did that literally once. I went, this is amazing, this is what I should do from now on. And then the very next week, I decided that that week I was going to try knitting while I recorded instead of painting my nails. The knitting went out, guys. I don't even paint my nails anymore. All I do is knit. I don't do anything else. So I wanted to knit a sock, and I had knit socks a couple times up until that point, not super successfully yet, and these socks would still not be super successful because obviously I wasn't checking my gauge and I was just using the size needles that patterns called for and not realizing that I was a loose knitter, and so I would cast on 64 stitches on like a US 2, which is really too big for pattern anyway, but lots of patterns are written for those. I had a whole book on socks, and I picked some Knit Picks yarn that was in my very small stash. Never had a large stash. It's the biggest it's ever been now, and it's quite small compared to basically everyone else I know that knits. But I did have some just random Knit Picks stroll in there. I picked a cable and lace sock that I thought would be fun, and I cast on, and I was like, this is what I should do when I'm listening to the podcast. So, or when I'm recording the podcast. So, I knit those socks, and I found that knitting them was just so relaxing at a time when I was really stressed about things like the election and other things. And when I was done with them, I wanted to immediately start another project that I could work on while I recorded, but I also found myself working on it, watching TV in the evenings, and just at all these other times. I was addicted to the way that it helped me manage my anxiety, which had never been a huge motivation for knitting for me before, but I kind of discovered this additional benefit, and I think it's because it was just a very high stress time. It was just the right thing for me then, and as I was knitting, I started to become so obsessed that I really wanted to talk to other people about knitting, but I didn't really know anyone else who knit. And through this, it just kind of occurred to me, because I listened to a lot of podcasts and I recorded my own podcast, that I might want to look up whether there were some knitting podcasts. So I found Never Not Knitting and the Knit More Girls and a few other auditory podcasts. I started listening to them, and I realized that I really liked listening to those while I knit. And then I started finding books about knitting, audiobooks, and listening to them while I knit. And the more knitting content that I consumed as I knit, the more obsessed I became, and the more I was doing it for hours every single day. And of course, through people like the Knit More Girls, I began to learn about Ravelry. I also listened to the Yarn Harlot, one of her books, and I think she talked about Ravelry too. Everyone was mentioning Ravelry, and I was like, what is this Ravelry? So I went and I got on the Ravelry, as they say, and of course, as I mentioned, I realized that I was already technically on Ravelry, but I'd never really looked through it. I discovered that there were all these patterns that I wanted to knit, that there were new yarns that I wanted to try, that there were forums where I could ask questions like, why are all my socks too big, and get answers. And I started to improve once again, as I did when I went through that period of watching Vicki Howell. I started to really learn new things, and I did stranded color work for the first time. Up until that point, I had done some slip stitch color work, and I'd done intarsia, but I had never done stranded. I had never successfully knit socks. I started knitting socks that were working really well. I started finding out about Quince & Co. and Brooklyn Tweed, and of course hand-dyed yarns, none of which had been on my radar before when I thought that I was real fancy for using knit picks and knitting with real 100% wool and alpaca and things like that, rather than acrylic. So at some point through Ravelry, or possibly I just had a wild hair to look up knitting YouTube videos one day, because of course I was also involved on YouTube at this time. I had a channel on YouTube about minimalism. So I found some, I think I might have, I'm not sure exactly who was the first that I watched, but in my memory, the closest that I can come to reconstructing my journey, I think what happened was I found Melody Hoffman through either her patterns on Ravelry or just seeing her beautiful photos, maybe on her projects page or something, and I found her on Instagram. Or maybe I found her first through Instagram and then Ravelry. I think it was Melody, which is funny because we're friends now. But I believe that I started watching her videos on YouTube, and then I started to get the recommendations, and I found Volan Vine and Inside Number 23 and just some of the big YouTube podcasts, and I really started to fall into that world. I didn't listen to the auditory podcasts as much because I really liked the video aspect. And all of this was happening incredibly quickly. I knit that first pair of socks while I was recording Return to Stars Hollow in October of 2016, and by December of 2016 I was recording my first episode of Yarn's Table. So within a couple months, this world of internet community knitting just exploded for me, and I realized that this was exactly what I wanted. I wanted this community of people to share my knitting with and to learn from and to share my knowledge with, and it just happened incredibly quickly, and it became this obsession where it was all I would think about all day was what else I wanted to knit next, and I would make plans, and I would come home and I would watch hours of knitting content while knitting until my hands hurt and my back ached. I was just obsessed. This is also when I started my first sweater, and when I started knitting socks that fit properly. And of course now I think of myself as a sweater and a sock knitter. Those are my favorite things to knit 2 years later. So this was really the knitting renaissance for me. This was where all the forces of my obsession, the community I was in, and learning new things started to influence each other so quickly and snowball, and knitting just fell to the center of my life, and it has really been in that spot for the 2 years since then. And the crazy part is that at this point I had been knitting for 18 years. I had known how to knit for 18 years, and I had knit fairly consistently for 18 years. There was never a period of longer than a year, if even a whole year went by, where I didn't knit something. But of course, the first few years I was a child, and so I just didn't knit much, and I didn't have much guidance. And then after that, I spent so long really just kind of swatching and experimenting and not having much to show for myself. And during all of that time, I was knitting one project at a time with gaps in between projects, and I was giving away a lot of things. And so the way that I knit now, the fact that I'm in community, that I use Ravelry to set up and make plans for what I'm going to knit next, and that I can't knit as quickly as I want to knit things, the fact that I'm moving from being a process knitter to more of a product knitter, the fact that I knit sweaters and socks, which I wear all the time, all of these things have completely changed the type of knitting life that I have. It's very interesting to me, because on the one hand, I feel the need to, for some reason, I feel the need to like defend myself as a long time knitter. I don't know why I feel that way, but it's like I think most people that I know that are this obsessed with knitting have only been knitting for a few years and they were obsessed the whole time. A lot of people that I know, either they picked it up as a kid and they set it down and never were interested again until they were an adult, at which point they became obsessed, or they didn't learn until they were an adult. And I think my story is kind of weird because I have been constantly knitting, or continuously knitting, I should say, for 20 years. It wasn't that I set it aside and wasn't into it at any point. And I always identified as a knitter, as someone who, like, knitting was in my top, it would have been in my, sorry about that. Knitting would have been in my top 5, at least, you know, interests that I would use to describe myself anywhere. And I see the evidence of that when I read, like, an old, you know, profile that I filled out for myself on, like, Facebook or whatever, and it, or I'll notice photos that I had taken where the people took photos of me and I'll be knitting in them, right? Like, a long time ago, my friend auditioned for American Idol in Atlanta, and I drove down with her and stood in line with her. And recently she shared this old photo of me in line knitting, and I hadn't remembered that I had been knitting in line. But it's like, there's this evidence everywhere that knitting had always been something I was doing. And so I am a long-term knitter. I'm not a recent convert, and yet there's just no comparison between the kind of knitter I was before, the kind of casual knitter I was before, and the full-on obsessed knitting freak that I am today. Both with the degree to how quickly I produce things and, you know, the quality of the things I produce, but also just in terms of how obsessed I am. So I think on the one hand, a part of me keeps waiting for the other shoe to drop. Like, surely this level of knitting obsession will not continue forever. And to a certain degree, it has calmed down a bit. I don't necessarily knit every single day now. I have days where I'm too busy or I'm too tired after work. And I certainly don't think that I don't spend the amount of time thinking about it just all day, every day, completely obsessed and unable to think about anything else, the way that I did a couple years ago when I was just discovering Ravelry. And I think that I'm like near kind of settling into whatever kind of knitter I'm going to be for the rest of my life, which is this type of knitter that probably does knit most days, but maybe isn't as manic about it as I was in 2016 when it completely took over my life. So anyway, that is my kind of unusual, I think, as from my experience, a bit of an unusual road to where I am now. And I hope that you all enjoyed hearing it. And I would very much like to watch and hear what your journey was. So if you post a video like this, please do give me a shout out and or send me a link and let me know so that I can check it out.